Rich, whenever you're ready.
All right, thanks. Hello, everybody. I would like to welcome everybody to our November fireside chat. We have an amazing group of panelists, and it's my privilege to introduce them and moderate today's session. My name is Rich Coker, and I oversee customer awareness and audits at SAP. Today's topic is navigating security and trust in AI compliance. And in this session, our panelists will discuss best practices for implementing AI while ensuring robust security measures, fostering trust among stakeholders, and adhering to regulatory and zero trust requirements. We hope at the end of this conversation, you will leave with a comprehensive understanding. Maybe some of you will leave with a comprehensive understanding. I hope to leave with a sophomoric understanding of the importance of security and compliance in driving responsible business transformation and instilling confidence in both users and stakeholders. I'm going to start off with introducing our panelists. And so Doug, Sam, and Jay, if you could introduce yourself, your company, and then we have an icebreaker question too. If you could share a common misconception about AI security and compliance that you've encountered, that would be great. So I'm going to start with Doug. If you could introduce yourself.
Awesome. Thank you, Rich. Doug Barbin, President and National Managing Partner here at Schellman, overseeing all of our service delivery teams. Schellman is a security compliance assessment and certification company. We've been around for over 20 years. We work with a lot of the leading technology providers out there, in essence, to help you show your customers that you're doing the things that you should be doing from a security perspective, from a sustainability perspective, from a variety of different elements, whether it's regulatory compliance, international best practices, and so forth. So yeah, pleasure to be here with my friends from SAP and Zscaler. So
great, thank you. And Sam?
Yeah, my name's Sam Curry. I'm Global VP and CISO here, and a fellow at the National Security Institute. I've been in cyber longer than we've called it that. I think I first started interacting with, I've been interacting with SAP for a very long time, but my first interactions with Zscaler were back during the A round when I was the CTO at RSA, and EMC made a strategic investment in the company. So I've watched the company grow, and it's been amazing to see. And those of you out there who know the company, of course, we're known for ZTNA or Zero Trust, and I don't think that will come up as much as it might in a Zscaler centric webinar, perhaps, or fireside chat. Do you want us to do your icebreaker thing now?
Yeah,
Doug didn't, so we'll go back to him. Maybe
we'll go back to Doug. Sorry, Doug.
This is so people know it's not scripted, right?
That's no, it's true.
Yeah. So go ahead.
No, go please. Yep.
No, you go ahead. You do it.
So it was the question was misconceptions on AI and compliance, right? Well, I mean, from my perspective, the biggest misconceptions always come around with oversimplification and thinking it's one thing or not another. And it's not just AI, right? It's what are you actually doing? Is it current next gen Gen AI? Is it machine learning? Is it natural language? Like what are you actually doing? We saw this right with the evolution of clouds. That's a thorn for me. Oh, it's the cloud. Well, it's the AI, right? Type of thing. So I think the misconception comes from oversimplification. We've seen this before in technology. I'm sure we'll see it again. But I think that just misconstruing AI like it's one thing or one deployment model is the number one.
All right, Sam. Hopefully he didn't steal yours.
Oh yeah, no, he totally took it. I have nothing. No, I think the first I would say two things. First of all, if 3 years ago I'd stood on a stage and I'd referred to machine learning as AI, everyone would have laughed at me. And much of the machine learning stuff that the applications, especially in cyber, have been going on for over 20 years. Like the first time machine learning was used, contrary to popular belief, to find things like malware was as far back as 2000 and 2001. Right? And the denigration of certain companies for saying they're only signature based, that hasn't been the case in over 20 years. It's anti-fraud as well, right? And it's being used for things like anti-money laundering and for finding misbehavior in card not present transactions, those sorts of things for a very long time. That's not new. So now what's interesting is that as soon as AI became the two letters of choice, we now include all the ML stuff in it too.
Mm-hmm.
And so very often we have these ethics boards or review boards, and they're very important. And as soon as you say this machine learning and something, people go, wait a minute, we have to put this through a review. And it's like, no, you've been using it for 15 years. Like, that's not actually new. It's, don't confuse it with Gen AI and with LLM. The second thing I'm going to say is, nobody should panic on what I'm about to say, because I think it's that common a misconception. The hyphenated word copilot is assumed to mean will replace human. And there are so many startups doing uninteresting things with copilots. It is the obvious blocking and tackling. And I say that because in cyber, we actually have an intelligent opponent. And that means that it can help to train analysts faster and can make them more efficient. It can also make them behave very stupidly if they're just punching KPIs. If they're just trying to like knock a clock and get their numbers up, and they respond only to what the AI tells them to pay attention to, this creates obvious holes. And so copilots are not the answer. They're part of the answer. And I would say that that's probably true in many domains, but especially true in an adversarial domain. So there's two for you.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. Now I'll go to my
Poor
colleague
Jay's
Jay.
been waiting.
Yeah, with his signature hat.
No,
Jay,
all good.
yeah.
All good. It's great to get started. Plus, he gave me more time to actually come up with a good icebreaker answer. My name is Jay Thomas. I'm technical advisor in the office of the Chief Security Officer at SAP. I did that role as an individual contributor before that office was formed, and ran also a series of cloud security improvement programs. Before that, I did industrial IoT and OT security, which I always find surprisingly apt, securing large business critical systems of any kind. And before that, I had a long stint in analytics. I'm one of the old business objects people, so I always like to bring metrics into the discussion. My icebreaker, the big misconception is I feel that people think that securing AI, separate AI security, but securing AI, the fight has already been lost. I would argue the opposite, and maybe riffing also a bit on what Sam says. If you're doing it right and you take the lessons of the past, many of these problems have already been solved, right? There's definitely a few new ones, right? But even those you may be able to avoid if you take a smart approach.
Great. Well, thank you all for your introductions and your icebreakers. Sam, I'm kind of hearing the theme from you around how quickly AI and the terminology and the assumptions around it have changed very quickly over a short amount of time. So I think I'll kick off the question to you. What are emerging trends in AI security and compliance that businesses like Zscaler and SAP should be aware of?
Yeah, I think what this has done is it has perhaps accelerated or amplified the notion of third-party and supplier risk. There was a time not so long ago when there were references to, quote, the greatest IP theft in history going on, because what the people were doing was taking enormous amounts of data and pumping it into artificial intelligence and large language models. I wouldn't go so far anymore as to say that, but certainly that was the talk of the town about 2 or 3 years ago. But what it is doing is saying, well, as you put this stuff into it, what is going out through the APIs and through the interfaces that tie into that? And it raises the SBOM question, and that's coming up in an AI context in particular. And AI is turning up more or less everywhere. In fact, HBR, Harvard Business Review, had an article that looked at, I'm sorry, I don't have the name, you can do a Google search on it, but it looked at businesses that adopted AI and when they adopted it, and those that haven't, and the impact it had on their core businesses. And it's a material statistical difference. The longer you take to do so, the more you lag your peers in your core business as a general trend. And and I say statistically significant, I don't mean that's like, oh, you'll be 2 or 3 times ahead. It could lead to perhaps, several points slippage in a market and margin impact. That's a big deal, especially over large markets. So then we get into privacy issues. And it's funny. I have a friend who was a philosophy major, and she was asked many times, "Why are you doing philosophy?" Turns out it's a six-figure job now because things like ethics matter. Even coming out of college, there are some places that are hiring for that. So, ethics, justice issues are big, right? What are the biases that are introduced either inadvertently or even intentionally in some data sets? And so that's coming up, and I'm seeing. I think I would mention is I've been making the case. So take all products out of it. Zero trust is a way to become more resilient in the face of disruptors in general. In other words, reducing your attack surface, having least access is a generally good thing when you're not sure, not just for AI, but there's more advances coming in AI that will be disruptive, right? If you look back at ChatGPT and what happened afterwards, because they got 100 million users in 2 months,
Yeah.
right? They really crossed the uncanny valley quickly. And so people started to anthropomorphize and started to impute human values to them, to Gen AI. That's just one. There's bigger things coming in AI, but there's also other tracks that are going to hit the world. Things like synthetic manufacturing and robotics and nanotech and quantum computing. We need to be more resilient rather than just default to open from now on. And what we're seeing in AI is now specialization of these applications. We went, hey, Gen AI, really, they're general applications. Now we're getting highly targeted, removing the hallucinations. That seems to be fading to the rearview mirror, what Gartner would call the plateau of productivity. And then you get the specific security issues, things like poisoning. We've seen kleptography. If you use it to write code and there isn't a library, it will invent a likely name for a library. And if you're a smart attacker, you'll go and create that somewhere in an open source library for inclusion. So that's happening. And inferral of models, the IP is there. So being able to protect these things in clouds from actual physical incursion, and also being able to prevent people from being able to derive from the feature space how they're actually constructed it's a big deal. Anyway, I'll stop. That's way too much. I'm sure some of those points, Jay and Doug will want to pick up.
Yeah. Doug, Jay, do you have any response to that on the emerging trends that you've seen? I particularly like the notion of the third party and supplier as SAP is a critical cloud service provider, right? And yeah, so Doug, do you have any thoughts on that from the Attest side?
Yeah, so I think what's interesting is the way that you laid it out, Sam, is the way that a lot of people, think about AI, right? And especially from a securities perspective, like, got this capability, grab it, got this capability, grab it. Oh, I got this concern. Uh-oh, address it, and it's a lot of that, right? And so where we're seeing companies, in addition to needing to manage all of that, and your point was excellent, right? If you were looking at something and it takes you 6 to 9 months to deploy something, you're probably behind anyway. And so how are they dealing with that change, with that constant change, right? And so that's where we're the companies, the clients that we work with are really looking at formal processes and programs to adopt AI and to manage AI from a risk perspective, or just from an overall enterprise perspective. And that's where we see the advantage of frameworks. Well, just not frameworks, like it's the only one that's been published to date, which is the ISO 42001 framework. And so I've done ISO work for a long time, and so what I like about this one is kind of going back to the pet peeve, the misconception. It's context specific. Are you developing models? Are you hosting other people's models? Are you just using technology? And then based on your use case, provides a framework for you to identify risk, manage those risks, assess yourself, and constantly kind of watch for all of the things that Sam accurately pointed out are things that we should be worried about. But if we don't have a process for doing that, we're going to catch a few things here and there, right? We're going to address a few risks, and then something else is going to blindside us because we weren't prepared for it. So.
Yeah. I definitely want to go into regulatory, but Jay, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I was going to go there actually, because aside from all of the things that Sam and Doug have said that I fully agree with, is also like we have to think through like what kind of use cases are we really doing? If you think of upcoming regulation, whether that's EU or elsewhere, there's usually at least sort of two parts to it. One is simply like, is your use case harmful, right? Are you intending to do bad things? Like we have a long record in AI ethics that we follow as strict policy and handbook that you can get from our website. Because first of all, like not doing bad things will get you out a lot of trouble to begin with. The second thing is that it forces you to figure out the use case that you really want to do, right? I think some of the repeat that we're seeing now is sort of the hope that we had by throwing everything that we possibly had in the enterprise in a Hadoop system, and then magic would come out, right? Whereas the ones that were more targeted in their use cases figured out which data sources were needed and under what kind of access control, ended up being far more successful and actually more likely to have a return on investment, especially when a lot of AI training resolves a lot of clock cycles with the either running your own data center or with a partner. So gambling wrong in the hope that something will come out, I think, is an important part.
Yeah, so Jay, I'll kind of stick with you for the next question. What do you see SAP's approach into integrating AI while also ensuring compliance with, not just specific AI regulations, but also, other ancillary ones that hit like, privacy and resiliency, availability that we see like in Europe, for example?
One thing that I find like really interesting about SAP in general is because we come from a certain culture and a certain type of applications, right? So something hallucinations in an ERP, AI assisted ERP systems, not happening, right? Like that's just not a thing that can happen, right? Like let's say you have a co-pilot doing your travel booking and says like, book me to whatever says in my calendar, and suddenly you arrive in the wrong at the airport and it's like, wait, this was supposed to be a domestic flight, right? So like you can't, for us, grounding in real data, whether that is through retrieval augmented generation or through connecting business systems directly and intermediating the interaction between a user and generative AI directly, saves so many problems in the first place. And because we are relying on that, it also means that we sort of escape another pitfall, and that is training on confidential data. Once you put confidential personal data in it, it's gonna come out. There's like, you can tell me whatever guardrails you're gonna put on it, but like it's gonna come out. Somebody's gonna be smart enough to come out with it. If you don't put confidential data in it, it can never come out. And it doesn't really matter whether, the company label or person name is part of the training. Put that in some like mask that doesn't really mean anything, right? Only look at the data that you really need for the use case that you have, add the RAG approach or connect it into business systems, and you get the benefit from having a context-aware LLM, but feeding it with data that's actually coming out of a system directly. LLMs don't add up very well. That doesn't really work well with general ledger and financial statements.
I do want to caution something though. Many years ago, I asked a colleague of mine at EMC, Chuck Hollis, what is big data? This was the old buzzword, right? Back in the day, and everyone was concerned. And Doug, I think you referred to clouds, and this felt a lot like clouds. And his answer, he said to me, and that's, you just made me think of it, Jay. He said, you're in a big data situation when you can get information out of a system that you didn't put in. So what he meant was that you could get PII out that you never put in. And so I do want to caution people that you could be leaking telemetry that allows for inferral and allows for extrapolation or interpolation. And so do be aware that you could be eroding privacy. So you're right, Jay, that if you don't put in something like a social security number, you're not going to get one out. But there was research done at a Carnegie Mellon that said you need 3 pieces of information to derive someone's social security number with about an 80, I think it was 83% chance or something like that. It was gender, birthday, and zip code. And so you might not have put the social security number in as an example, but do keep in mind you still want to be protecting that information as if you did in many cases, because there truly could be an enormous pool of information that is not part of your tenancy. And if you have a leak, that could be an issue, right? So I just want to
completely agree, Sam. Like, I should have maybe clarified
No, I
that,
agree with you,
like,
but I
as a
knew you wanted that
European,
extra
even
bit.
though I'm in the Valley, like, but in SAP, like, personal identifiable information essentially is like GDPR type definitions, right? So that includes postal codes, like anything that could identify a person on a whole series of categories, right? So like we get down to like, transaction of something, of so many things going to somewhere else, right? Is just sort of the level of anonymization that you'd want. Certainly not these tricks like, oh, we'll just try to get a list of everybody in a certain postal code, and that just happened to be the headquarters of a very large organization.
Yeah, or at least classifying that data, like having a data classification schema is probably just the minimum, right? To just make sure that, hey, this is what this is, these are what these S3 bucket storage, looks like, and
this
make
is
sure,
where tenancy and multi-tenancy
mapping,
matter. This is hosting matters. APIs become a new control point in many cases, and doing inspection of the traffic also matters, so that you understand and having knowledge of what the applications are. So it's one thing if you're applying it in a private environment, to borrow the old cloud language, or in a data center, or in a cloud that you control. It's another thing when you start to open this up to external tools that are accessing, and what are they actually processing offsite, and what is accessed in a chain of suppliers. Suppliers in quotes, right?
Okay. Well, I think as AI adoption continues to accelerate, that obviously will put trust and compliance at top of mind. And I think there was a study from KPMG that like 72% of CEOs say generative AI is like a top investment that they should be investing in. However, like 81% of them are also concerned about the lack of regulations for generative AI within their specific industry. So Doug, like some questions from pointing to you at least. What are you talked about use cases? What are some regulatory trends and some compliance concerns you're seeing from being a public accounting firm from your clients?
Yeah, I mean, I think the EU AI Act was the one that's caught the most people's attention that we've been talking about. Since then, it stands to go into effect as early as as next year, and for certain scenarios. We've also seen different regulations attempted to pop up. Out here in California, we had one. It was vetoed. I do believe that something will come back. That something like that will eventually find its way back. So I think the regulation piece is important, and especially from the EU, because it follows. There's a lot of themes that I personally find that follow GDPR and what happened there, like GDPR, and then there's some standards. They were a little looser in terms of how you would demonstrate adherence to GDPR, right? ISO 27701, which is the privacy ISO, doesn't specifically address GDPR, but people use it as a program to help them comply with GDPR. And that's where I actually think, kind of go back to, wasn't really jumping to compliance right away with ISO 42001. I am of the belief that a well-run ISO program is a good security program, just like a well-run AI management program under 42. It's not about the certificate, right? It's not about the one page. It's about the having the program. So I think the EU regulation actually specifically called out ISO 42000, and the regulators have called out ISO 42001 as a means to demonstrate adherence, which is much more specific than what we had with GDPR and those things there. I think there's the states. I think other places will adopt things similar to it. The federal government is already, if you're in FedRAMP, they're already looking at that as part of the as part of the program. There, we've got companies that have developed and deployed AI technologies, and if they're offering them to their public clouds, the public sector, they need to go through the appropriate level of authorization, change control, red teaming, pen testing, all of those things. So we're active in a lot of those spaces because it's about demonstrating for for a particular use case. But I don't even think administration changes aside. I don't see that going away much. I mean, regulation could go down, but activity could go up, and it's a the same things are going to be out there. That doesn't impact Europe obviously as well. And I think that's a lot where a lot of companies are focused on was the European AI Act, not just because it was first out there, but it was it's something that a lot of us could easily see, if not getting regardless of whether it gets picked up at the U.S. national level, it's going to get picked up here in the U.S. It's going to get picked up by states like California, Massachusetts, and others that have been on that same, follow that same kind of cadence when it comes to things like privacy. So
yeah. Sam, have you, from your side, I mean, I think, from the SAP side at least, I think it's really difficult to see where different regional regulations overlap and where they differ and what sort of, and I think, I think that's I think we even had this conversation earlier, Doug, in our earlier session, right? Like how do you foresee having to adapt to that, and like, and how do you foresee that without knowing exactly what, how they're going to enforce it even, right? Because we're still very early on in these regulations.
The fact that it's early on, I think, is perhaps the most important thing. There's a few trends to watch in regulations. First of all, regulations exist, generally speaking, because companies in particular, but also government agencies, aren't doing the things they should be doing. So FFIEC came out and said you should be doing SIM and you should be doing strong authentication because banks didn't do that. And then they did. If you take the case of PCI DSS, it went to an extreme. HIPAA did the same thing here in the United States. So what happens is, if you're not getting the result you want, as opposed to just the prescriptive thing to do, fines then start to go up, and the specificity of requirements goes up. So PCI DSS is an example of that. But the original HIPAA fines were $5,000 an incident. The program might cost $1 million. I remember in the case of FERC NERC in energy, fines went to $1 million an incident. Why? So it's the pressure keeps getting turned up. So the fact that it's early days is an important point. The second thing to mention here is, in the case of European legislation, which was just mentioned, there are some regulators starting to tell, especially in Germany and some other jurisdictions, don't trust the attestations and certifications. So when you go through one of these, it's important to go through it and get your paper, and also retain the evidence and have a system for being able to present the evidence, because they're going to come and ask to see it. And so the certification is still good. The process is still good. The framework is still good. Going through all that's still good. But now you may need a system of record to be able to demonstrate it multiple times, precisely because there are some firms that have gone through just the paper exercise rather than doing it deeply. Now, the final point I'll make is, I'm a big fan of when the dialogue is happening among private sector, public sector, and academia, because it's the evolution of the dialogue that will determine what we need to do, and maybe gives us a chance to get ahead of the regulations, because we don't actually know what we're supposed to do yet. There's a lot of hand waving where people are going, oh yeah, I know what to do. Let's just start slapping some things in place. We don't. We're still discovering the capabilities of much of this technology and the applications. And the conversation is necessary. Linguistically, it's necessary. And as the technology evolves, that ongoing dialogue, we will have the forums to determine what we will have to do. To somehow think that today we have experts in AI who will know what is needed in 4 years from AI we can't yet predict is self-delusion, if I put it gently. And so I'm very interested in the multinational discussions. So there was a very encouraging set of discussions between the UK and the US. There were some that brought in some European governments as well, and the European Union. It's when we start to have dialogues about, so what should we be doing in order to meet, like the executive order that was over 100 pages that gave guidance to get to the right regulations and legislation. It didn't say this is what you should be doing. It said go and use these principles to determine what those things are. And while those conversations can be frustrating to engineering types who are like, so what's the right answer? And I put myself in that category through most of my life, right? Actually, the dialogue matters. It can be frustrating as heck, but it matters.
I would hesitate, though, to wait until we all have had a debate and we all agree to what the protections should be, right? Like, because more from a perhaps practitioner perspective, is a lot of the things that are coming or are already known. I think, as you said, Sam, are things we often already should have been doing in the first place.
Yeah.
Right.
Some
So
of
you have
it's
to protect your
predictable.
data. You have to protect your access, your identities, your workloads, etc. And that is not really that different when it comes to AI use cases, right? A lot of the lessons that we've learned before, we can apply. If we get training data, right, make sure that it's protected, ideally as well protected as the source system. Otherwise, make sure that we have very limited people have access, and maybe we can anonymize or mask on extraction because our data scientists don't have to know the particular details, right? So there's many of these things that we can do ahead of time and be participants in the conversations as well as practitioners in case of SAP as a service provider, right? Like I would think that in general, we are in agreement with many of the principles and ideas behind these regulations. Where we sometimes want to make sure that we have influence is to make sure that they're also practical and achievable, right? And I think that's how we come to these standards that then end up ideally being adopted by everybody who may not have the ability, is not moving that quickly ahead, or the capacity to be part of this conversation.
The only other thing that I'd add that's going to drive, these discussions are definitely good and healthy, but what's going to drive them in a little bit more of a reactive state is we know that over the course of the next months, there's going to be bad things that happen with AI technology, and people are going to be like, how did this happen? How did this, how did all of this data get into this third party model? Well, we know how it happened. But there's going to be a lot of, anxiety. There's going to be a lot of, excitement put around, and it could force some, those things we all know from history force rash decisions at times.
Yeah.
And so I'm worried about that too, that the dialogue could get thwarted if all of a sudden there's a major breach, which may or may not be a breach, but they call it a breach in the news.
Yeah.
because a model, that the data underlying with the model it has been released, right, type of
Yeah.
thing. So
Yeah, you don't want to see a knee-jerk reaction from a regulatory perspective to a single incident and then focus on that incident to the detriment of other potential threat
That's right.
vectors. Yeah, and I'd say that like from a ISO 42001 perspective, like the intent, like Sam was saying, that like there's people are even from a DORA perspective encouraged not to rely on attest anymore. But I think from ISO 42001, the intent is not to put a stamp on something and say, look,
Correct.
it's been sealed and delivered in quality. But I think, to Sam's point is that all the evidence and a readiness that you're doing for ISO 42001 as an example is something that you could reuse for other regulators or auditors that are coming into your environment and taking a look at it. Yeah.
This you need a defendable position, right? That's the primary benefit of a third-party assessment, is to help you defend your position. And in this particular case, because we're still evolving and we're still learning so much, right? We have to, you as technology providers have to make reasonable assumptions on why you did or didn't do something and be able to defend that, right? So,
so actually, guys, this is not an indictment of any certification. Quite the contrary. What it's saying is, these are really worthwhile.
Yeah.
However, what it's saying is that some people that use the system need to be double checked.
Correct.
That's so it is saying it's so worthwhile, make sure it's true. It may be another way to look at it. And I think there's some basic blocking and tackling that we can definitely define. And then there's some things that are emerging, and then there's the things we don't know yet. And that's why we should have some simple regulations, and we shouldn't be thinking about, well, I don't have to do it until it comes. We should be taking part in those conversations. The forums need to exist, and we should take part of it. But I want to point out something. Our adversaries don't have these guardrails. That's not a justification for anything on our side. It's just, let's remember that the rate of innovation on the dark side, if you will, is very, very high. And so it behooves us to do this. There's far more of us on the light side.
Yeah.
And there's far more technology to bring to bear and innovation, but we move more slowly. And this is a classic problem, right? So it behooves us to start now and not to wait.
Yeah.
Because they are innovating. And there's another trend going on that I didn't mention earlier, which is we're using AI in combination with other tools. In other words, we're using various AIs together. We're using ML, we're using automation to have a combinatory effect.
Yeah.
And those are proving to be very powerful. So are the bad guys. Right?
Yep.
They are, in other words, industrializing it
Yeah.
to a certain point.
I feel like
would
they've got a
add
little
to
bit more
that
free.
a
They've got a little
bit,
bit more free time than we have, right? So the bad
Yeah.
guys.
Yeah. Go ahead, Jay. Yeah.
I would
Please.
add to that, we've had a discussion with some of our hyperscaler partners on this very same topic of, you know, adversaries are doing it, they're less constrained, but like we have two big benefits. We have the data in many cases, access to data in a much more legit way, and we can operate legally. Now that might get a little bit different once we get to things like nation states and so on, but that gives us a lot of benefits, and
Yeah.
these are also players that can invest quite a bit of money in
So
those type of things.
this is where we get to a word that's been abused a lot, zero trust over the years, right? As a buzzword. What it really means is least privilege and least function. Jay, you touched on that earlier.
Mhm.
And actually, one thing is we do for SAP we have a product called ZPA. As one of the things we do is we actually can stand in front of SAP applications and help to reduce that exposure or attack surface. It's a reverse proxy functionality, and as part of SAP Rise, so as people are adopting and taking that can happen. And actually, we have some new features coming out in January, among the first, I think, among partners for SAP to do that. But the idea here is don't expose it. Only enable what the business requires when it requires, and then have the means to do inventory and to check it and because really you should be doing authorization and you should be monitoring and you should understand what is interfacing with your data and your functionality.
Yeah.
That's what you need to do, and then not by default open. We want to limit things like discovery by opponents, exploitability. We want to put deception in the path. We want to limit lateral movement, and that includes all environments. So
Yeah.
it's that notion of least function and least privilege that we should be deploying everywhere right now. It's a good thing for all disruptors that are coming. AI is one of them.
Yeah, and this is also why we focus so strongly on these business connectors, retrieval augmented generation, because you can execute within the context of the user's privileges in the systems they already have, right? So it still preserves the who are you, where do you come from, can you access this information, are you allowed to do this transaction?
Yeah. This is great because we have staying cognizant of the time, and what I was going to go is go around the horn here and ask what some value adds that SAP and Zscaler and Schellman are doing, basically giving you a chance to plug something, because we don't do things to avoid fines, we don't do things to avoid exceptions or such, so Doug, do you have anything on your side that you want to talk about, what Schellman's doing from a AI perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're both client facing and internally. We're investing heavily. We're training heavily. To me, that's a very important part. When GPT first started hitting the mainstream, we had made a quick update to the employee manual to make sure that they are cognizant that putting client data into ChatGPT was in fact a violation of your employment agreement, which says you can't share client data. So education on things like that, but the desire's there, right? So our own IT teams have looked over, okay, what can we do internally to make us better users of AI, in addition to what we're doing across our company, which is getting our people trained on whether it's 42001, our penetration testing teams going out to conferences and training to learn how to beat up on and break LLMs and different models, right? Because there's different attack vectors that they need to consider that they didn't have to consider for non-AI powered, or I'll even say Gen AI powered applications, right? I think the machine learning and some of the other types of platforms and quote unquote big data, right? Like we've got a good amount of experience in doing that. It's making sure that we're coming to the table with the right tools so that the companies that have hired us to do it can get can get valuable security insights out of it. So
Great. Sam, Jay, any last plugs?
Yeah. So one of the things that I think is important to realize is that we sit in the path for a ton of transactions, effectively half a trillion transactions a day. And that includes, as I mentioned earlier, when people are trying to access SAP environments and so on. And so we use AI and ML in particular, and we do so in a privacy respecting way. And multi-tenancy matters a lot. We use it for things like data protection. We use it to do cyber, and I mean, is something risky? Is it likely to be malware? Is this activity likely to be the person that you think it is? And we also have a data fabric on the back end that we construct of all the relationships among the objects. So now we can start to see the pathways users take. And there's very clear pathways, like in a graph theory model, that say, hey, this is what your users use. And this one didn't do this, it did a different motion. And that's indicative of breakout behavior. And so that putting that in place lets us then have effectively the lab to do all sorts of machine learning and AI modeling there. The other thing we do is on the traffic in transit, we can ensure that you're having, where is the AI ML interaction happening? And it's the right kind of interaction with it. So there's an awful lot we can do when we sit in the pathway for anything to anything in an organization, making the authorization decisions and actually looking at all the traffic and inspecting it.
Thanks. Jay? Oh, you're on mute.
Oh dear. I would just add, have a look at our SAP AI Foundation platform. It's the same platform that also powers Joule. It's the same platform that we use internally. And it's an exercise also in third-party risk management. Like, we did a lot of work to come to agreements with third-party service providers. Some models we run in the platform itself, and see if that is the way you want to do things. It includes like integrations for RAG, both structured, unstructured data, so that you can like take care of some of these things, knowing like, okay, this is the chain of custody, compliance, etc., that has already been done. Especially if you're in a situation, smaller, medium-sized businesses, where there's sort of okay, we want to have access to these things, but everybody goes kind of off on their own, each department, and this might provide you a way of doing these things, but in a more governed way.
Well, great. Look, I really appreciate the discussion today. I think there were no conversational lulls, and that's always a great thing when you have a fireside chat.
We could do one now if you want.
No, we're good. We're on time. It's at 10:45. I like that when we end right on time. But on behalf of the three panelists here and myself as a moderator, thank you so much for all of you who are attending or viewing this recording later. Really appreciate it. Sam, Jay, Doug, always a pleasure to talk to you all, and I hope to see you again sometime. Yeah, thank you everybody for attending. Appreciate it.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.